welcome to all. I'll let you just a couple of seconds. Hello to everyone. I'll introduce you very briefly and hand over to our fantastic moderators. So let's start with you, Marco Arcelli, your CEO, Aqua Power. Over here, you're confused. Yep, confused. Yeah, there's some change considering what happened this morning. Yes, you switched. So yes, please don't hesitate to just say wave a little bit so that I know that I'm sure I'm not mistaken. So we have Marco Arcelli, your CEO of Aqua Power. We have Arnaud Nicolas over here. Thank you. Your partner, Antin Infrastructure Partners, in charge of Inda Aqua. Stéphane Reyna, you are head of infrastructure debts at Swiss Life Asset Managers France. And we were supposed to have also another speaker with us. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, Patrizia Rutugliano, so she's really sorry for not joining us today, but we have very interesting views also with you here. Let me introduce also, as I said, our fantastic moderators here. Please welcome also Laurie Chenet, you are head of Green and Sustainable Hub for the region EMEA, and Barbara Riccardi, your regional head, Middle East, Caucasus, and Central Asia, and both from NATIXIS CIB. Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everyone. Indeed, the idea is to speak about climate change adaptation and the consequences from a water perspective. Climate change adaptation has been defined by the IPCC as the process of adjustment to the climate effect in order to harm them, but also to take the benefits of the opportunity that it creates. So this is the idea today, is more to focus on the opportunity side for the infrastructure market and not particularly on the risk side, which is pretty well covered right now. So from a water perspective, what does it mean? Climate change adaptation consequences are mainly the increased severity and frequency of flood events, and unfortunately we have some recent, let's say, news in Spain, for example, but it's also on the other side, the increased severity and frequency of droughts. So we will see and try to cover all the potential water challenges that it creates for the infrastructure market. The specificities of climate change adaptation is that there is no, let's say, universal way to measure it, no impact metrics. But it's also the fact that it's really dependent on the local and regional context. So there is no unique solution to perfectly address the water challenges that we have to face. So it will be a case-by-case approach, even in the identification of the opportunity that we will cover during the panel.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and good afternoon, everyone. So I think we have the perfect combination of panelists today, because I think we can address exactly what Laurie just mentioned, the difference amongst the different problems that water scarcity, water flooding, and water efficiency might cause, and what are the opportunities that arise from there. We're going to do the panel in two sessions, so in two questions, let's say, so we're going to keep it a bit more focused and give you the chance to exchange and not make it boring. We realize it's just after lunch, so we want to keep it nice and lively. So on the first side, we're going to discuss about what are the technological challenges that we are facing when looking at water. And I'm looking at you, Marco, because obviously coming from the region where I'm also living, in the Middle East, water scarcity is really a key element, although we've seen a bit of excess on the other side sometimes as of late. So from a technological standpoint, Aqua Power is obviously the investors when it's about desalination. So can you give us a bit of color on what you are doing, how that is applicable for the Middle East, and how that is an investment opportunity, not just for the Middle East, but more widely?
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Aqua Power and what's going on right now in Saudi Arabia under Vision 2030. The pace and the scale of the cultural, social, economical change is unprecedented. Saudi Arabia is going through the biggest decarbonization program in the world, turning the energy system to renewables, gas-fired, so low emissions, and developing the economy, non-oil economy, and that, of course, is increasing a lot of the need for water, potable water. And before I moved there, almost 2 years ago now, I thought that there was water scarcity in Saudi Arabia. Actually, what I realized is that there's all the water you want. you simply desalinate it. And the cost to do it today has reached a level, and I know it because Aqua Power is the largest private desalination company in the world, and a company that introduced reverse osmosis many years ago in Saudi Arabia, which is something that technology that drove down the specific power need, power consumption, so the amount of electricity that you need to produce 1 cubic meter of water from more than 15 to less than 3. We're now at 2.7. So 80% reduction of power needs to produce the desalinated water in the last 15 years. That means that today the tariff that we can offer is in the range of 35, 40, 50 cents depending on the local conditions. So that's per 1,000 liter of water, per 1 cubic meter of water. So if you think that today, even on a subsidized level in Europe, you pay water more than €1 per liter, per cubic meter, you see that desalination is cost competitive. The other thing that we're doing in Saudi Arabia right now is making it sustainable. So not only to use less power to make it, but to take it from renewable energy sources. So most of our new plants, about 30 to 40% of the generation is on-site solar power PV. And we have one case, the Red Sea Global, which is one of the biggest tourist destination. It's 100% solar driven. So we have 400 megawatt of solar panels, 1.2 gigawatt hours of battery storage, the largest in the world. And we're using that to power basically both the electricity consumption, but also the water desalination. Incidentally, also the wastewater treatment. And we do it through a circular economy solution where basically all the sludge that comes from the hotels and the accommodation of the staff basically goes into pools, ponds, where it loses the nutrients, which is nitrogen, creates forest of mangrove, and then the residual water goes to the nursery where 30 million plants and bushes will be grown for the landscaping of all the resorts. So you see how everything is becoming green, and it's part of the Saudi Green Initiative to plant 600 million trees in Saudi Arabia by 2030. So basically we're effectively, if you see it from Google Maps, turning the desert green through desalination as well. Now, we're bringing this expertise outside of Saudi Arabia. I always say that the scope and the goal and the mission of Aqua Power is to turn Saudi Arabia from the largest exporter of oil to the largest exporter of low-carbon technology. Today, we operate desalination in 4 countries where we offer we serve the needs of 25 to 30% of the local population. We were recently awarded the first project outside of the Gulf in Senegal. We tendered the first project in Azerbaijan last week, and we're negotiating on a bilateral basis for a plant in China. So you see how all this is being exported out of the Gulf to serve the needs. And I continue to receive calls, by the way, from ministers in Spain, in Italy, where the drought is really becoming an increasing problem.
Thank you very much, Marco. And I think just talking about Europe now, and we shift a bit on also the problematic. So you mentioned water scarcity or desalination as a solution. Now, Arnaud, looking at you and your investment in Indagua, obviously you have now the understanding, the expertise of how it works, what are the challenges from a technological standpoint in Europe, in particular in Portugal. And I think when we discussed earlier, we mentioned that operations is really a key element in your assessment, and that's where you're working more from a technological standpoint to optimize and invest. So can you maybe tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, of course. I mean, in short, climate change makes water management even more critical in that it makes all the water challenges really worse. And what's interesting with water is that we often take water for granted. Unlike energy, by the way, we never took energy for granted, and especially not since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. But the water resource exists, and Portugal, like a number of other European countries, and certainly like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, is facing some of the consequences of climate change. Typically droughts. Typically, there are longer droughts than in the past, and it puts a strain on the water supply, certainly. When it does rain, there are also heavier rainfalls, and that also puts a strain on the drainage system. And so climate change is creating a need for more investment in the water infrastructure system in Portugal, like in a number of other European countries. And there's clearly a consensus that investing today in the water infrastructure is a more profitable investment than waiting for the consequences of climate change to arrive to make the investments that will be needed by then. But in my view, in my opinion, there's also a more important issue today, which is what you were saying, which is the water losses, or what we call in the sector the non-revenue water, which is also a very pregnant issue in the Middle East. And there's numerous plans which have been conducted, and numerous programs which have been conducted by the Saudi government, for example, to try and reduce the massive water losses that a number of countries face in that region. But it's also a very prevalent problem in Europe, where the water losses can reach 30%, 40% sometimes. And what we call non-revenue water is really composed of two different things. There are the physical leaks, and so we all know what it means. It means physical leaks in the networks. It means issues at the level of some of the pumps or some of the valves. But there are also commercial losses, and commercial losses can arise as a result of controlled consumption, but which isn't built, typically fire departments using water networks, or illegal connections. So households typically connected to water networks and illegally using the water from a network, and so that's a loss fundamentally for the private operator. And typically, if I look at Portugal, there's, and I think we can come back to that later. I think you wanted to also talk about the economic model, which is behind the reason that in Portugal there are some private operators, and especially the one that we own, which is the market leader there, that have managed to reduce drastically the non-revenue water to levels which are close to 10% today versus 30, 40% sometimes for numerous operators across Europe, and certainly the public operators in Portugal. So there's an economic model that has incentivized the private operators to find all the possible ways to reduce the non-revenue water. And there are numerous things. First, there's clearly a focus in private companies and in the one that we own to identify leaks as fast as possible and to repair the leaks as fast as possible, so the physical leaks. And I can say a word about some of the technological solutions which have emerged recently that also help that process. There's also a focus on detecting all the illegal connections and working with the local authorities to make sure that those illegal connections become legal connections. There's obviously also a focus which has been put on ensuring that people that still use septic wells for septic tanks or their own wells connect to the network, which is available, but sometimes a number of households do not connect to the networks. So there's a range of initiatives which have been put in place, and with the appropriate incentives also across the teams in those private companies to make sure that there's a really strong focus on reducing the non-revenue water. And if you think of the impact that it has, if all the public operators in a country like Portugal, it would be true in other countries, were operating at the same level as the company that we own, for example, which is a market leader, it would basically mean that there would be an extra 80 days of water supply that would be available for the country. So, you know, when I see, for example, that you know, in the south of Portugal, there's a public tender, for example, at the moment for a new huge desal plant. It's an economic nonsense, because there would be a much more rational way of actually having more water supply available for the water networks. From a technological standpoint, I think that's what's quite important. What we're seeing is really a focus on two things. So one is having the sensors and so the metering infrastructure, what we call DMR or AMI, deployed within the water networks to produce the information, to produce the data, And then there is something else, which is having the tools to assess the data, to analyze the data, and to do something out of it. And there's been, so sensors are really key to help to produce that information that you can then use to better predict demand, to better identify leaks and identify leaks as fast as possible, and also to repair the leaks and to optimize the CapEx programs that you deploy. You also use machine learning increasingly to identify abnormal data points that your sensors produce, and to also increase the automation of the network. So basically, managing the water networks more efficiently. So there's really a full suite of solutions and of solutions which have been put in place by private companies. And the one last point that I would mention is energy savings as well. We should just keep in mind that 1 ton of water, 1 cubic meter of water is 1 ton. So moving water around in the networks consumes a lot of energy. Treating the water also consumes a lot of energy. And there's a range of initiatives that you can pursue to reduce to really reduce your carbon footprint, reduce the energy that you consume, and produce more self-energy. So typically biogas, and you can also install solar PV plants, on the facilities that you own to produce the electricity that you need and make your energy mix greener.
Very clear. Thank you very much, Arnaud. And now moving on to Stefan, on your side, obviously from an asset management perspective, when you look at the infrastructure that is, adaptation infrastructure and technology, where do you see, your investment going? What is more, let's say, interesting for you? Where do you see the trends?
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So we're both asset managers in an insurance company. But we're using the same pockets to provide both financing or insurance coverage. That comes from the savings from my clients. Firstly, by doing this on water, as mentioned by Laurie, water can cause dramatic events and then cause death. But firstly, water is the only essential utility we all need to live, because without water we all die. So this means that it makes water something very sensitive globally, socially very sensitive, and the impact of climate change on all the water cycle will be tremendous, because it will not only touch us as human beings, but it will touch the earth in terms of the impact we have on the soil. So the approach of a group like Swiss Life, which is not very different from the other big insurance companies investing in the world or providing insurance coverage, is a sort of, we're sort of third party in the game. The first and the most important thing is probably the very definition of what the public entities will define as being the, let's say, the water politics, probably. So how the water will be treated globally, and what are the impacts on every piece of water, what are the future infrastructures, and the operators, the technicians will provide solutions. And us, we're bottom line. In fact, we're just providing money from the savings we have. So what we do for the time being, facing the climate change challenges, is that we're observing for the time being. We're observing what are the potential impacts on the long term, because we're going to invest on the long term. We're going to provide probably insurance coverage. It's shorter term, but for investments quite long term. So we try to provide solutions which will face the challenges, but also which will not impair the savings of our clients. And the clients, it's you and me, in fact, at the very end. So this is what we're doing, and we try to think very simple by focusing on essential needs, and that on the long term, these needs will remain in place, and this is what we have to focus on.
Thank you very much. And I think you touched on the let's say on the investment part, the need of finding a way to also finance those type of infrastructure. That was the second part, let's say, of our panel, and I leave you, Laurie, to deal with it. So, what are the from a financing perspective, what are the challenges, the economic structure framework that are required to facilitate those investments? Laurie, please.
Yeah, you were mentioning the public policies, but definitely when it comes to how to finance that, globally the adaptation finance is, especially on the private side, let's say remain very poorly tracked and addressed. It's still the poor relation when it comes to green finance or climate finance. However, this is interesting to have some figures in mind, because actually the climate adaptations holds a strong business case for investment. In terms of estimated benefit cost ratio, it goes from 2-for-1 to 10-for-1, meaning that $1 invested can generate between $2 and $10 in terms of return of investment. So from a business case perspective, it appears to be interesting. But when we look at where we stand when it comes to adaptation finance, this is globally relatively poor. So the idea was to try to understand what are the enablers, I mean the levers that you see in order to scale up and accelerate the development of the climate adaptation solutions or technology that we just mentioned. And especially when we look at all the needs in terms of adaptation, the infrastructure sector represents 23% of the needs. So it's relatively important, and we clearly see that we need for investment. So it's a call for that. But from your different point of view, starting with you, Marco, what are the main, let's say, levers in terms of how to access to funding? Is there any specific mechanism? I'm thinking about PPP, for example. How do you see the main lever from your point of view?
So we are an independent power and water producer. So everything we do is contracted, is on a long-term contract for 20, 25, 30 years in project financing. That means that of the roughly $20 billion that we invest every year, I would say that about 14 billion is project debt. And then of the 6 billion of equity, because we don't consolidate, so we keep about 30-40%. So say 2 billion is our own equity, covered mostly by EBLs, and 4 billion is partner equity. So we invite either other strategic partners, but also financial partners, pension funds, private equity, and so on. So that's a little bit the split. And what I see is, let me divide between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and the emerging markets. So Saudi Arabia and the Gulf is investment grade, established, and so I think I would welcome everybody to go there, to come there. There's volume that you don't see anywhere else. There's also a lot of competition, so I think that if you come there and expect emerging markets returns, you don't find them. You find US type of returns, but the risk is same or probably smaller, because I think that the regulatory risk, the political risk is not as high as in Europe and the US. And I tell it, coming from Europe and the US all my career. So there is one big pocket of opportunities where it's purely commercial, and I think it's about competitiveness. But if we turn to the other countries where we operate, so we're in Africa, we're in Central Asia, we're in Southeast Asia, what I notice is when they ask me what's the recipe to, for a country to, what's the best policy? And I say the best policy is leadership. Second country in our portfolio is Uzbekistan, which I would never imagine, to be a leader in the energy transition. But then when you find a president who has a vision, sets clear goals, and then has a dialogue with investors and takes quick decisions, and by the way, this is done on a dual track, bilateral negotiations often government to government, and tenders. The tenders are longer, smaller, but they give you a reference in price. The bilateral negotiation is faster, bigger scale, and allows you to do all these transformations. So that is where, if you say other countries, how can they, and I get to the project basically, but first you need to have a project that can accelerate these through these. Then when you go into the financing of the project, I think that what we do is kind of what you were saying. So for every dollar that we invest, we mobilize 10. And so our role is really the role of an enabler, where we bring the best technologies from around the world to offer the cheapest solution. And then the biggest cost that you have in that solution is the cost of debt, because the cost of debt is disproportionately more impacting the final tariff than the return on equity, because of course if you put 70% or 80% of debt, then of course you see the proportion. So how do we make that debt cheap is we work with DFIs. And the big thing that we're doing with DFIs is to convince them that they need to take more risk than the private sector. So if they offer 10, 12 years of tenures, why should they do a return on the equity on 20 years? So we need them to move to 20, 23 years of tenure on the debt in emerging markets. That's the first thing. And the second is to work through them or even directly to philanthropy. There's $2 trillion per year of philanthropy, and honestly, I'll be very cynical, they like the photo op, rather than something that is really impactful. Because imagine funding water desalination or a power generation project in countries like Nigeria or Tanzania, or Tanzania has twice the population of Saudi Arabia, has the population of Italy, roughly 60 million, and the total power installed capacity is 1.5 gigawatt. There is one power plant in Saudi Arabia. So how do you turn them? You need to make it affordable for them. If I look at the recent project that we signed in Senegal, the tariff can be reduced by more than 30% if we can access 50% of the debt on a concessional basis. So what needs to happen is this virtuous circle where really we use the infrastructure projects as catalyst to reduce the cost of debt. And then on the equity partners, I think that what we're trying to do is to convince them that the risk in infrastructure projects in emerging markets are not as high as people imagine. If you look at IMF records, the insolvency rate, the bankruptcy rate, or the default rate of countries in Africa is the lowest in the world. It's less than 2%. So if you can come on long-term patient capital and take a return that is, of course, higher than what you would see in Europe and US, but still a little more acceptable, you combine everything together. So we bring the technical solution that is cheap. We broker everybody around the project, and we bring DFIs, concessional financing, and patient long-term equity. Then I think that we can change really the narrative for Africa and the emerging markets.
Thank you, Marco. Coming back to Europe with you, Arnaud. You quickly mentioned the economic model that you're facing in Portugal. Interesting maybe to elaborate a bit on that, which is a model that you consider as maybe one of the enabler of the way to finance this type of water solution. And as well, maybe your testimony as a sponsor, and to see how do you see the main levers in order, especially in Europe where you're based, you see the development of this infrastructure market.
In Europe, there are various models. So if you look at Belgium, if you look at Germany, if you look at Scotland, Ireland, all the northern European countries, water management has remained in the hands of public monopolies only. There are some other European countries like Italy, like Spain, like Portugal, like France, where the market is actually mixed. It's a mix of public operators and private operators. Portugal is, so where we have a company in the water sector, started its privatization process in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 1990s, and you only have more or less 20% of the market, of the retail market, of the retail water market, which is in the hands of private operators. And that will continue to increase, especially given the massive infrastructure investments which are needed, and the fact that a number of public operators have relied upon public money in the past years and on subsidies from central governments and also on EU money, and that given also this very important principle in Europe of consumer pays, you will see an increasing participation of the of private operators in the sector in Portugal. And what we found particularly attractive in the Portuguese market is in the private water market is actually fundamentally linked to how the regulatory framework works for private operators. So you've got long-term concessions, I would say between 25 to 50 years. Traditionally, initially 20 to 30 years, and you've got the possibility to extend those contracts up to 50 years as per the regulation. You have inflation-linked contract, and you can also obviously pass on the increases in the bulk water cost that you face. But in Portugal, the bulk water is a cost. And because it's a cost, you have fundamentally an incentive to manage the water as efficiently as possible, to reduce these costs and to make sure that you charge to end customers as much of that water that you transport to your networks and that you reduce your commercial losses. You also have this fundamental mechanism that all the efficiencies that you generate, you retain them during the life of the concession. So the more efficient you are from an OPEX standpoint, from a CAPEX standpoint, from a losses standpoint, we're talking about losses, you retain the economic value of that, and that is why we saw a lot of value creation potential also in a private operator in that country. And that's why today a company like Indaqua, which is the market leader in Portugal, has 10% of non-revenue water, which is a third or a fourth of what some of the public operators in Portugal have. So the economic model, we found it extremely interesting. We think that the private sector participation will continue to increase in the coming years as a result of the investment plan, which is needed. The replacement rate in Portugal is quite low, in fact. Because the investments are actually lacking in Portugal if you look at the publicly managed water networks. The reason is simple. Water tariffs are still pretty low in Portugal, and the tariffs barely pay for the OPEX for a number of networks, not for the ones obviously that we manage, but for a number of publicly operated networks. And as a consequence, you need to sacrifice on the CAPEX programs, and that's what a number of publicly managed water networks are suffering from. And so when you look at the investment plan of the Portuguese regulator, you see that there's billions of CAPEX that need to be invested in the water networks in the coming years. And that will trigger a new wave of privatization at some point to allow for those investments to be made.
Thank you. Stefan, maybe as an investor, so we are on the other side. So what about your investment criteria when it comes to water infrastructure? And do you put how is it integrated in the value model on the allocation of your capital maybe, and enabling at your level the development of such technologies and infrastructure?
Thank you, Laurie. So as mentioned previously, water is still very sensitive to price. It's one big problem with the water project is that you've got huge investments, huge capex, and you've got for private operators, and you've got sometimes very long-term useful lifetime of the assets. So if we were to make the things properly, we should provide the private operators very, very, very long-term financing in order to provide them with the ability to lower the tariff for the end users. One key point for us is of course the fact that we can predict the revenues for private operators in order to size correctly what would be the, let's say, senior debt being able to finance them. So if you've got fixed costs and variable revenues made on the, let's say, the consumption, if the consumption decreases, you're facing, you can face a cash shortage. That can happen. That's a real issue for us. That in most of the, let's say, European countries, we see a combination of different financings where there's a part of course, of equity, but there's a part of subsidies also, which can provide a sort of buffer or in order to have the lowest pricing for the end users, because if you've got this subsidy buffer, and it will also lower the cost of the senior debt, and it will lower the end cost of the cost for the end users. So this is what we're looking at, and in the market today, I think that there's quite something strange, because we can easily finance, say, a 3 billion US or Euro data center without any problem, because we've got investors to do that. We've got big projects like this, and it's quite rewarding for our private clients, for the savings we're managing. But very strangely, Thames Water is going bankrupt. So it means that there's a very issue in some places in order to pay for water, or for water services, which are essential. So I think it's quite strange to have such a dichotomy, if you say, paradox.
And maybe one really short question on my side for each of you. We were mentioning the idea of having opportunity for the infrastructure market, but based on what you've all say, between in terms of impact, the balance between risk and opportunity, what will be your choice? If you just have one word to say, risk or opportunity for the infrastructure market?
Do we have the choice, in fact? Do we have the choice? Water will come, so we will have to make the sewage networks being able to cope with this water, and because you have casualties in front of that. And if we have drought, that's the same problem. So do we have the choice? I think we don't have.
I see a world of opportunities in all these markets, so come.
That's the Saudi one speaking.
No, because people are worried about, political risk in these countries. But again, if you're building basic infrastructures like water and power, they cannot afford not to pay you. And that's the biggest risk. That's the only risk. And you don't have regulatory risk because you have a contract that is secured with guarantees. So really, that's why I'm saying that these emerging markets are much less risky than they look.
I would just, in line with what I was saying previously, that in Europe you have a limited set of opportunities in the municipal water sector, because a number of countries only rely on public models, and so there's not a lot of room for investors like us, especially for private equity investors. In the industrial water sector, it's probably a different story, because it's also linked to climate change and water scarcity, and when priority needs to be given to a group of users, priority is always given to first households, and then it's given to agriculture and irrigation, and only at the end it's given to industrial clients. And within industrial clients, actually, first priority goes to the power sector, and in particular in a country like France, where you have the nuclear and so the cooling needs, and then only at the very bottom, all the other industrial clients. So water availability is an issue, and on top of that, you've got all the purification needs, which increase. You've seen the PFAS regulations in the US and the new EPA regulation a couple of months ago becoming, that got decided. So in that space, there's certainly more investment needs and more opportunities for private investors.
I think we are reaching the end of it. When I see you coming in, it's a sign that time is over. So,
Thank you very much. A great applause to you. Thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions, so we have now some microphones around the room. Please don't hesitate to raise your hands if you have any questions in the room. We have some people, some ladies with microphones. Any questions? Well, I think you had some other questions maybe on your side.
maybe one question. Having gone through the world a little bit, and you've seen the different challenges. On one end, I look at you, Marco. Obviously, there is the creation of an infrastructure that allows the water to come in, so the desalination. On your side, I know, and Stefano, I guess, is more dealing with fixing something that is there that is not as efficient as it should be. What can you learn of each other? Is there any way to cross, let's say, the borders of what's new, what's existing, and how can you use it for each other's best interest? I get it, it's not an easy question, I understand that.
Thank you. Well, I think there's a skill set and an expertise that a private operator that got created 30, 40 years ago has developed over time, and that can be probably exported and used elsewhere and in other countries with less advanced water infrastructure. So that's certainly a case. Marco talked obviously a lot about desalination and there will be more desalination need in some European countries, of course.
You want to add something, Marco?
So I think maybe 2 points. One is really come and visit Saudi Arabia. You'll be fascinated. You will then move all your headquarters, not the regional headquarters, to Saudi Arabia, because the scale and the speed is amazing. And honestly, I invited an Italian journalist, prominent Italian journalist, simply to come and visit our plants. And then around that, go to a restaurant, see people, and all that. He came back, wrote a book, and he called it The New Arab Empire, and also the stabilizing impact that it has in developing markets, which is also helping Europe, by the way. So that's the one thing. The second is, and I go to my quest for long-term patient capital, and I'm talking to all these, maybe not even you, but your customers and the ultimate people who put the money. The answer I get is we don't invest in emerging markets because then the rating agencies are discounting it more, and then we have, we need to keep more capital, and so it's not effective for us. So I think that collectively we need to work, if we want to really have an impact there, to change some of the rules, and that could be the big global contract, let me say, to drive climate change investments in the emerging markets, because at the end, whether it's water or energy, it's 80% of the need in the world.
Any questions? We have some time left.
Easier than mine.
Well, actually, I agree with you. Saudi Arabia is very fascinating, actually, in its potential. Well, thank you very much to all of you. A great applause. Thank you.